Hello, Ryan of the future.
Weird stuff.
Welcome. What do you mean weird stuff?
Weird stuff is going on, man. This is a special episode.
It is a special episode. We have come, I guess it's not technically the future this time.
No.
It is in comparison to what we've done already. Things that have been set in motion that cannot be stopped.
We had a great conversation with some great people, and you're about to listen to it, fellas, folks, listeners,
folks, people,
dungeon crawlers.
Dungeon crawler. Oh God, let's not do. Hey guys, welcome Dungeon Crawlers. This playthrough
up,
of
crawlheads?
D&D 5th edition. We're about to beat the game. No, I'm just kidding. We're very far from beating the game. We're actually at the opposite end in this episode, in this conversation. The very beginning, before the game even begins. What does that even mean? What's he talking about? This is blowing my mind. Holy hell, dude. So, who are we talking about?
So we talked for about an hour or so with Birt and Jesper Schmidt, two great authors who also have a podcast called Writing Fantasy. It's got some really interesting stuff. If you're interested in writing, period, then it's got some good stuff about publishing. But also, if you just like world building and fantasy stuff, then there's a lot of detail in there for you as well.
Yeah. And if you are very excited and you want to invest in your writing skills, so to speak, and you like class and courses because school wasn't enough for you, work wasn't enough for you, there's some information about a course they do near the end of this that they do on world building. Whoa. You guys have done an episode on that. I know, but these are a bit more credible people. They've got like 20 something books. I think she even says like 25 books under their wing.
They got a lot of years of experience.
A lot of years of experience, more than I do. And I learned a lot. And I think even at one point, Ryan was like, oh, I want to take that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm taking all of it. Yeah. And it's, I mean, now we've built that relationship too. We can have conversation with them in the future about other topics. So it'll be good stuff. I hope you guys enjoy the conversations. It's really good, really handy.
I'm very excited about continuing to talk to them and having the episode come out because it's literally very useful information in our Discord. One of our friends was like, question about this thing. I'm like, just wait. The episode, it's going to be so good.
Hold on to your horses.
But without further ado, and to let you guys get straight into it, the juicy bits, I suppose, as always, well, not as always, for today, like usual, that's at the end of it. He's Ryan.
He's Brax. Oh.
This is the Dungeon Crawl, and we're going to be talking about world building with Autumn and Jesper Schmidt.
Yeah,
so
I didn't get to say this in the episode, but if you enjoy this, then please go to rate us 5 stars. You know, we're doing the whole spiel this time, so just go to Apple Podcasts, rate us 5 stars. You can find us on Twitter, all sorts of fun stuff. Everything's in the link tree down below. But yeah, let's just hop into the episode.
I just revamped the link tree, by the way.
Ooh.
I don't know if Ryan looked at it.
But no one wants to hear us waffle anymore.
Yeah.
Let's get into the podcast. There's lots of great stuff. An hour of chunky content in front of you. Enjoy it.
Bye, everybody. So, for people listening in the audio versions, wherever you are in the world, you probably can't tell just yet because there aren't 4 voices.
True.
But with us, we have Autumn Birt and Jesper Schmidt. We're very, very excited to introduce these to you. They reached out to us a few days ago about a particular topic within the title that you might have seen already, but let me introduce them and you'll get a feel for what they tend to like to do.
Mm-hmm.
So Autumn Birt, she's the author of the Rise of the Fifth Order series, and her favorite is Friends of My Enemy, as well as her most recent book, Dark Fae Outcast. And for Jesper Schmidt, the Keystone Bone trilogy, my apologies, and something else that he's also produced and made is Fantasy Mapmaking, a step-by-step guide for world builders.
Whoa, world building.
Mm-hmm.
That's nice.
I think we'll have all that in common during today's podcast. So it'll be exciting.
Yeah, and together you guys have written like over 20 fantasy novels, something like that. Recently you guys both did another kind of story book called Story Idea, a method to develop a book idea. And together, I mean, obviously they do the Writing Fantasy podcast. If you guys have not heard of it, please go check it out. I took a creative writing class in my undergraduate college career, just because I love fantasy, I love writing, and it was super cool, super worthwhile. And so I've listened to a few of their episodes already, and it's really good.
Cool.
And they reached out to us specifically because they're doing a course where they go over world building, and we'll get into a little bit more of that as we get deeper into the episode. But in the meantime, if we missed anything, please, Jesper, Autumn, please introduce yourselves. If we missed anything, please go and mention that now.
Oh, I think you covered it pretty well. I would say. I mean, we've been writing both nonfiction and fiction books together. So it's been quite a journey. But we've sort of dedicated 2021 to fiction. So that's basically everything we do this year.
Which is fantastic and a lovely change from building courses and the nonfiction books. So it's really been great to write fiction together. And we both, before we met up, were writing our own fictions. And so, we came to each other with a backlog of our own trilogies. So it's, when you throw it all together, we have, I don't even know, we've never added up our years of experience, but I know we're over 25 books, I think, now between the two of us easily.
Absolutely. And that brings a question to me, and one that we hadn't prepared just yet, but I'm super curious how you guys came together initially.
Oh, you want me to tell the story, or do you want to?
You can do
always
that.
make me tell it. Well, I will say I think we met him on Twitter because we were both fans of Worldbuilding. And I had done a blog post on Worldbuilding, like Worldbuilding 101. And Jesper had just written his, I think, fantasy map making book. And so we connected by kind of like cross-posting, and then I had done on Am Writing Fantasy the first course that was on writing the Ultimate Fantasy Writer's Guide. And Jesper recorded a bonus session for it, and he was kind of traded off the course, and things grew. And I had started Am Writing Fantasy on my own, and I think 2017 I was actually hiking on the Appalachian Trail, and I'm like, oh, that would be the coolest URL. Someone else has to own it. And like 5 days later, I got off the trail, and I'm like, oh my gosh, no one had it. So I bought it like that and started Am Writing Fantasy, and it was doing well. And I was trying to think of someone I could partner up with while I was on another hike. I do a lot of hiking. You'll find that out in some of the, probably as we talk today. And I thought of Jesper when I was hiking, thinking who's someone who would really network well with me, we'd get along, who had similar interests. I mean, Jesper came with a YouTube channel that, like, how many episodes? It was like 2 years you've been doing YouTube. And so he had this whole other side that I hadn't been doing. I had the courses that he hadn't been doing, and I sent him an email. I told him it's like asking like a blind date. It's like, hey, I got this thing. You want to team up? And he said, yeah. He came back with a business plan and kind of took my creative chaos. I'm good at the chaos part, and he's good at the organizational part, and it
meld
works
it together
perfectly. And our skill sets, we hardly ever argue. We always come like, oh yeah, exactly, that's what I was thinking. But we come with completely different skill sets. It's really awesome.
That's wonderful. And
that's how the best ideas happen too. You think someone else already has it, and then you pull up like that's how the dungeon crawl for us too. We're like, how does no one have this already? Perfect.
Exactly.
It's very similar for Ryan and I. He's quite organized, but also chaotic and creative. And when we do disagree, it's really collaborative. So I'm thankful that we don't butt heads very often.
No, that's true. And I think as well, what you guys might have experienced as well is that it's not necessarily disagreeing in the sense of disagreeing, but I feel a lot of the time it's more like challenging each other. And oftentimes, especially, on the topic of world building, for instance, or even fiction writing on what should happen next with the characters and so on. I often find that the end product becomes a lot better because we can basically challenge each other and like, no, that was the easy way out, and we need to make it more interesting and so on. So it's always good to have somebody there on the other end who can also pitch in some ideas, but also just challenge when you're being too lazy or easygoing with your decision making.
That's very true. That's very
absolutely
true.
I know if I was on my own, it would be a lot of cutting corners. So Ryan is such a great partner for me in regards to all that we've been doing so far. But I mean, without further ado, let's dive into world building and get into the meat of the episode, if that's okay.
Oh yeah,
that's so great.
So super straightforward first, I suppose, is just why the fantasy setting. I mean, you mentioned earlier that you decided this year is all about fantasy, but why?
Oh,
well, yeah. For me, at least, it's basically always been fantasy. Ever since I was a child, I've just loved. I read fantasy novels all the way back then, and I've kept reading it, kept watching fantasy movies and so on over the years. And then at some point, I think actually many years ago, I thought about that I would like to write some stuff one day. And if I had to write anything, it had to be fantasy, because what else? and then I sort of had it in the back of my mind that it's probably one of those things that I could do one day when I retired or something. But then one day I was sort of thinking, why is it that I have this idea in my head that it should be something I do in 20 years from now? Why couldn't I just do it? So I just made a decision and started.
And very similar. I mean, when I found a short story on dragon impression written by Anne McCaffrey, and that was it. Dragons, Pern, was totally in love. And so from that point on, it was fantasy or nothing. And I'm also a graphic artist, so a lot of my drawings are towards fantasy. A lot of my thoughts, it's just what inspires me is completely fantasy. And I actually had wrote it during classes, how you mentioned you were in classes, Ryan, and it's like I would flip open to the back of my binder and I would start writing short stories instead of notes. And oddly enough, it was my husband who found one of those journals. He's like, this is actually pretty good. And I started taking it more seriously. I actually have a studio art and English degree, so I brought that up. I polished it off with a few more classes on novel writing and creative writing, and there was never a doubt it was going to be fantasy, because it's what shaped, I think, a lot of who I am in my own thought patterns, considering where I grew up and the environment I grew up on, and I see the differences in how I see the world and interact with the world. And I fully blame and thank fantasy writing for giving me a different world perspective, and I want to pass that forward.
Yeah, there's something about the sci-fi fantasy genre. I don't know what it is, but it just ticks something. I mean, it's definitely my favorite genre too. I have a soft spot for good horror as well, but I mean, there's something about fantasy that just keeps pulling me back into it. So I guess kind of going along those lines, what is exactly, when you're writing your own book or building your own world, what does world building mean to you guys? I know it's a loaded question.
What is world building? Well, I would say it's definitely, I can't say it's completely always another world, but it's got to have certain fantasy elements, because my Tainted Fae series, which is my most recent solo work, is set in this world, and it's more of an alternative timeline. It's got magic and fae, so it's more urban fantasy, but it's got this whole realm of fantasy creatures and magic. And then, what we're writing together with this, which is Elysium and some of my earlier novels, I mean, it's a totally different world. So there you have different cultures, planets. It's so nuanced, but it has to feel real, no matter what element you're touching, looking, what does a dragon smell like? What does magic sound like? Those are qualities that will feel real and everyday to the people who live there, unless, of course, magic and dragons are rare, but...
Yeah, I guess very similar for me. I mean, I just love world building. That's why as well I can get too much sucked into it and spend ages on it. So over the years, I've had to sort of learn myself to wheel back and know when to stop. So world building disease, I guess, is something we can come back to. but I think to me, it's integral to the story itself. I mean, to me, the setting should be so deep that it almost feels like a character in itself. Like it plays so much a part of the story that if you move the story to someplace else, it would just feel off, basically. Like it just fits together. So it's a very important element to me.
Yeah. I was just gonna say that kind of makes me think of, I think when people think about world building and stories and stuff, I think a lot of people think of them as like separate entities, but you really gotta like connect them, combine them together, make them interweave. Otherwise, like you mentioned, it's just gonna feel off. It's just not gonna work.
Yeah. So in the same vein though, how do you manage to tie the story and the world together? Because they're two very separate things. You can have an entire world and no stories you've written and vice versa. So I'd love to learn about that as well.
Yeah, we do talk quite a lot about that as well. I think the main thing is because you can sort of go off on two different spectrums. You could head down the road of saying, okay, I have this story I want to tell, and you work all that out. You know everything, your characters and everything that you want to happen and so on. And then sort of as an afterthought, you start developing some sort of world that would fit to it. Or some people also just don't develop the world at all. So they just start writing and then they'll figure it out as they go. Or on the other hand of the spectrum, you have probably more the way where I came from originally, like you love to world building too much. So that's all you do. You build like a million things. And then at some point you'll start to try to figure out, I wonder what story I want to tell. And I think the key is really to try to merge those two and find that middle road somewhere, so that you're building the parts of the world that you know you're going to need for this particular story. And then you don't get yourself or allow yourself to get sucked into all the other details about that foreign region or continent over there that has nothing to do with anything. I mean, it's great to have it on the map. We also are creating world maps for our world where like 90% of it, it's just on the map. We have no idea what's in there. But we'll figure out one day once we get to a story in that area. But it's more about trying to co-develop it in my mind, right? So that also when you're building, for example, to use the map as an example, that you're putting things on the map that you know that this is stuff I'm going to need in the story. It's not, you create a full map, it's look wonderful, and then you're sitting there and trying to figure out afterwards, I'm not going to use half of these cities for anything anyway. So yeah, but it's tough.
It is tough.
And Autumn, for you?
Oh, it's the same. And we have such a very similar perspective. Jesper manages to put it into words, but it's like when I wrote my first fantasy trilogy, I developed a world that fit the story, and I developed mostly the places where I knew people would want to go, the elements I needed in the story. And when we got together and we said, okay, we're going to build a world and write novels together, how are we going to do this? We created, thanks to Jesper, we put that into an actual system and outlined it. And that's sort of what became the world building course, is we created this method that works for us, and it works really well. And you don't get too far into the weeds, because I'm definitely more on the story side. I just want to get into writing. And it's not too far into the weeds the other way, where it's all about just creating this world. And how does that even relate to your story? You spent 3 months building this really cool kingdom and this really cool part of history, and maybe you'll get back there in 5 or 6 years. No, you need to focus on what's going to happen for your novel and try to stay focused on both sides. Where is your story going? You want it to almost develop once. You're building the world and you're building the story at the same time. It's a jigsaw puzzle that all fits together like so perfectly.
Yeah, and similarly within world building and stories as well, kind of taking a magnifying glass and zooming in a bit, you are working on those locations that you've decided are important.
Yes.
There's so many components to it. And I know you can say, here's the story, what's relevant to it, but where do you usually start when zooming in?
I think that when we look at the first question, we actually look at the era. We usually come up with a story idea, a synopsis, something that's like 2 sentences, maybe a paragraph of this is sort of our story idea. And then we start saying, where does that fit? What kind of world time period would work the best for this? I mean, is it space? Is it medieval? Is it future? Is it underwater? We start developing that kernel first. And that's usually, I would say, that's our first step.
Wow. Yeah, for a lot of tabletop RPGs, people have their favorite one already. So the setting can be decided for them. And something I've noticed is people get hindered by the general, era that tabletop RPG is. Dungeons and Dragons, for example, one of our great friends who's been on the podcast before, he really dislikes D&D when people are trying to make it like a space adventure. He's like, there's Spelljammer, there's different things that you can do with that. So I love that you guys have addressed it. And don't be afraid, I suppose, to jump around within different tabletop RPG installments, I suppose. Yeah,
and the interesting thing here is really that by just changing the setting, it influences the story quite a lot. So before you get too much into the weeds, it helps a lot to just ask those, famous what if questions, like what if this was space? What if this was underwater? What if this was like an isolated mountain region where nobody could get to, and just sort of challenge yourself a bit, because we all jumps to our favorites. I mean, I love the medieval settings I've always just loved it. The very classical, you mentioned D&D. It's a very classical D&D setting. I love those settings. So that's instantly where my mind jumps first. But sometimes it's actually good to just challenge yourself a bit about would it be more interested if something was changed? And not necessarily did you have to move it into space. It could also just be some of the elements within that setting that you're going to change and just make it a bit more unique and a bit more different. But at the same time, of course, we love tropes for a reason. And they're there because everybody agrees that these are great. So I also think that there is a point to be made about not trying to make something really weird and different that nobody has ever seen before, because chances are most people won't like it. So if you can find, like, again, the balance between having enough of the tropes that people like, but just changing some things that makes it different, then you're sort of hitting the sweet spot there.
Yeah, what you're saying kind of makes me think of like how steampunk, was created, how it's like kind of combining these two different ideas. Like, what if there was, this another sort of technology that existed? And I think kind of what you guys were saying earlier too makes me think of when people are designing, like for me, when I was designing my world for our D&D game, I, had this huge map and I'm like kind of planning stuff way off in the distance. And it's I think it's easy to get stuck in like, D&D, the players can go anywhere they want, while in a story, it's kind of more intertwined. You get to choose where the characters are going. But I think you need to keep that in mind, that it's still, the story is important. The character's going to care about the story that you've put in front of them. That still pay attention to the area that they're, because if the area that you start in is not well built, doesn't look well, doesn't feel well, then they're not going to want to explore everything else. So I really think people need to start thinking about it that way.
That's true. What you just said made me think about another thing as well, because of course it is important, like we said before, not to get too sucked into all the details. But on the other hand, at least with the starting area, like you said there, it is actually good to have more details than you need, because if you know it, whether you are an author or you're a game master or whatever, but if you know those details, it will influence things without you even paying attention to it yourself, and it starts feeling more real, because it feels like all of a sudden that you feel like if I walk over the horizon over there, there's going to be something over there. I might not be able to see it, but I just have a sense that there is something, because the author or the game master or whoever, they know that there's something there. So just that illusion there is enough to make it feel very, very real, even though if you might not know exactly what's over there, but you have some ideas about it, and that's often enough.
Yeah, it builds this sense that the world's bigger than it actually appears.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I remember there was a moment in the game that Ryan's been running for us for about 3 years or so, where he introduced a map that we were on a certain country, or what we thought was the world. And all he said is that there is something else out there. And we saw some land masses crudely drawn on a map. And for me as a player, without hearing much, and Ryan could have written nothing about it, the world opened up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That's amazing to me.
I think it is so important. And we consider that. I mean, you should always have just a little bit of an idea, like a 20% out of the whole 100%. Just you look over there and like, well, that area is going to be forested, or there's going to be something, just some kernel that feels very authentic and real that you're going to place there. Because being able to say that offhand, saying, oh, well, that's where all the orcs are from, just to know that makes it feel that much more depth, even if you haven't gone in and built it yourself yet.
Yeah, have it kind of tied into the history.
Yeah.
And you were kind of mentioning earlier, Jesper, you mentioned the world builder's disease. And I think this is very, very easy to get caught up in. I know I have, like, we took a break from our game for a little bit. And I was like, all right, let me prepare everything else around the world. And then it's just, you get so caught up in all these random kingdoms have nothing to do with where you are. How do you force yourself to break that and just start the story, even if you feel like it's not complete yet, but it doesn't need to be complete?
Yeah, well, actually, we have a module in the course that we call the Creators Lab, and we actually structured it very tightly. And I guess to some degree, I did it for my own benefit as well, because otherwise I get sucked into all of it. So we try to. It's basically like it's easy to go through, but at the same time, it's massive. So let me explain that so that it makes sense. Because basically what we tried to do was we said, what are the like mandatory elements that you need? So we defined those, and we have given there's video step-by-step instructions on how to develop each of the mandatory things. And then we said, on top of that, you can decide up to 3 optional things that you want to add on top. And then I think we have, like, if I remember correctly, something like 25 step-by-step video modules on the optional things. So you just pick 3 of them, 3 out of the 25, and then you develop those because those are the ones that you feel like fits the most to your world and your story. And then you leave it at that and you move on, even though if you feel like all the other ones are amazing and I want to do those as well, but no, you just move on and get into your story and start telling the story or writing the story or whatever you're doing. So we actually try to box ourselves in, but also, of course, box the students of the course in, so that this is what you do and nothing else.
I mean, that'll be so handy for me. I remember when I first started building my world, I like looked up world building questions like online, just kind of get myself thinking. And there was like 100-page with like 1 billion questions. Like, okay, let me just copy paste this and just go one at a time.
Yes.
And yeah, you can get bogged down in doing every single detail when it's not even remotely necessary.
No, you can spend 4 months doing that, and then by the end of it, you're like, what am I going to use all this for?
Yeah, where's the story for this?
But actually, I think that the other side of the coin, or the problem of doing that is actually that because you have it, you have so much time investment in it, and because you did that, you start feeling forced to. Then I have to use it, so you'll start shoehorning it into a story where it doesn't really belong, because it's like, well, I built all of this, so I better use it now. And then it starts feeling artificial, and it feels like, well, where did that come from? Why is there all of a sudden a guy riding on a dragon over there? And well, that's because the dragons was born 500 years ago over there in that country that has nothing to do with this stuff. But then he just flew over here, and it's just like, yeah, but
yeah, it's one thing to have Easter eggs, but yeah, you don't want to like just force inject it into the story when you don't need it for the story as much as it's cool.
Yeah, I think game masters can do that a lot.
Yes.
Because you'll make something cool and then you're like, I want my players to see this. And so you'll just force them to see it when it's like, okay.
Exactly.
That's me.
Exactly.
That's me 100%, because I make an encounter or a city or an NPC, a character that I just really want to show them, and they never go there, but I know to not railroad my players so that they have a sense of freedom, because it's unique to playing a tabletop RPG.
Sure.
So something that you touched on earlier, Jesper, is that these cliches, these set parameters in our world do exist. I want to ask, is there ever a need to be different from pre-existing worlds or cliches?
Ooh. I'll take this one
yes.
if you want. I think I think there is a need, because if you are exactly like everything that's been written, you won't be remembered. And that's, I think, the worst thing. So if you're a writer, an author, they're going to be like, oh, this is based just on Dungeons and Dragons. This is based just on this other thing. They're always going to remember that first one, the one that's well known and famous. You want to have at least something that is unique about your own world, something that is really beautiful, way your writing should have like a twist or something you're known for, your author's voice, but your world should also have something that is so real and mesmerizing and totally unique to what you've created, while still having that element of familiarity. Like maybe you do still have elves, maybe you do still have dwarves, but they're unique to your world. I mean, think of Twilight and the vampires. Everyone knows, it's not Dracula now, it's Twilight. So there's that twist. It was something familiar, but you add a different element and it is yours and it's unique to your world. It gives readers something to grasp onto, even if they don't remember the author name. They'll be like, oh, did you see that one where the thing and oh my gosh, and it was just mind-blowing. And that's what you want, to get that passion into the people either playing your games or, reading your books.
Yeah, I mean, I'd argue that's why Tolkien is so well remembered, because it was so different for its time. It was, completely out of left field. Be like, this is what we want. So now they base, like everything else kind of on that idea.
Yeah, exactly. And I would have probably say that if Tolkien did his thing right now, I'm not so sure it would be successful, to be honest, because it would. Yeah. I mean, if we assume that nothing like it existed, and he came with this sort of medieval world full of orcs and things and whatever, and let's just assume that nobody had ever made it. I think he would, in today's day and age, he would have a hard time to get enough readers to actually like that, because it's just too different. But the thing is that he did it way back then, and since then the culture has sort of been built on top of it. So now it's become a trope, and steering, like Autumn said, steering way too far away from those tropes is actually going to hurt you. So, but at the same time, you can't just copy them. But Autumn explained it well already.
Absolutely. And kind of in a similar vein, observing those tropes, say somebody really has some inspirations they have to insert into their story. They're willing to take the risk, but is there a line to draw when taking inspiration from other works, from other stories, from other worlds?
No, well, we have actually we also at some point wrote a book about how to get story ideas, and what you said just reminded me of something we wrote inside of that book, because we wrote that every story you can ever think of has already been told. So that I will challenge anybody to come up with something that you can never find anywhere else, and I think it won't be possible. So the thing is that, of course, you cannot like copy and paste stuff from other places, obviously. But there's absolutely nothing wrong in getting inspired from existing settings. There's a bit of Tolkien stuff over there. I really like those elements. I'll change it a bit to make it my own, of course. And then there is a bit of Wheel of Time there, or Brandon Sanderson there, and sort of like you get whether you like it or not. It could be a conscious decision to get inspired from other things, but it could also happen unconsciously. But whether you like it or not, it's going to happen. So, and sometimes it even happens that you develop something like you're not even aware that it exists already, and then somebody else will point out, well, that's similar to that thing over there, and you're like, oh wow, I guess so, but I wasn't even aware, right? But that just proves the point that everything you can think of has already been made.
Yeah.
I think a lot of my kingdoms and world building stuff comes from like whatever I'm watching or reading at that time. Like it'll just, like you said, unconsciously kind of come through my work. And I think with tabletop stuff, I think it's easier for people to kind of get away with like literally putting in the exact same plot of a story in. But I think then you get that problem where you'll have a player who's maybe experienced that or seen that movie, and they're like, this is that, and then that they can't see anything else. And I think that's you don't want that as a tabletop RPG guy. You want them to kind of see this as, you know, a fresh, true, new story and get people involved. So I think it'll directly take them out of the story too.
Yeah, you break the immersion immediately when they recognize that this is a copy from somewhere. Then it's not a story anymore. Then we're just being, you know, puppets in some sort of play that already exists.
Yes, you always have to do something to change it up and make it more original, make it yours. You don't want to be either accused of creating fan fiction or just stealing the entire plot and like Romeo and Juliet and moving it into another. Mm-hmm. There's certain ways when you're writing fairy tales, you're allowed to take Cinderella and rewrite it from a male point of view. That's sort of the point of redoing some of the fairy tales. But when you take someone else's like best-selling fiction fantasy story and you literally just change a few characters and drop it into a similar world, you just don't want to do that. That is almost, it's not plagiarism, but it's copying so much. And again, you're just going to be accused of having done it, and you're not going to be remembered for it except for, oh, you're that person who totally spoofed that other writer. That's just not where you want to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, indeed. But I do think that there's a slight difference though between when Autumn and I are writing fantasy novels that is a commercial product versus when you are like playing your own home setting campaign with your friends and in role playing. I mean, there you can get away with a bit more copy. And so, I mean, if you know your players and you know that they don't know this thing that I stole from over there, then you can easily get away with it. But if you do it in commercial fiction like ours, then you can't get away with it, right? If you copy and paste something in, well, people will come for you. So
Absolutely. And something I know I've run into is I tend to jump between so many different stories and so many different genres a lot that you can tell in what I'm writing that I had a different thing in mind, and it definitely changes. It makes it feel jumbled and mixed up. Have you ever experienced that when writing?
That's a tough one. I would say I do notice that when I'm reading a book in a certain genre that it'll influence my words, my setting a little bit. But usually I try so hard to keep it pure. I don't read and write at the same time. I'm task oriented. So I tend to write and then take a break and read. I compartmentalize really well. I joke that I have a filing cabinet system in my head and I just make sure I close the correct file. But, you know, it leaks through, but we tend to plot out everything we do. So no matter what is happening, we're pretty true to that original idea, and maybe it filters through, but by the time Jesper writes it and then I write it and then we edit it, you couldn't tell. It's so smoothed over. It's a nice little flattened cake.
Absolutely. So, Autumn and Jesper, I want to know, bringing it to yourselves, you've mentioned hiking already, Autumn. Where do you tend to take inspiration from your own lives?
Oh, I'll start there because that's a fun one. I'm actually an ecologist with my master's degree. So I have an environmental science and ecology on top of the studio art and writing. And one of the best things is actually in 2016, I left my full-time job, which was with sustainable agriculture. So I had all this agriculture and ecology experience, but my husband and I traveled around the North America for 100,000 miles for 4 years. And we've seen deserts, we've seen, been swimming in Florida Keys, we've actually been swimming in the Arctic Ocean up in Tuktoyaktuk. So Labrador, oh my gosh, if you want a setting, I haven't made it to New Zealand. Jesper's made it to New Zealand. I am so jealous. But Newfoundland and Labrador are amazing provinces if you want inspiration for like fantasy settings and these massive rolling mountains and oceans. It's just fantastic. And so when you're writing and you're like, oh, everyone does a desert that looks like the Sahara, but hey, the Mojave is so cool. And you start looking at the Atacama and Chile. There's amazing places in this world. And if you like history, if you like to read about ecology and plants and insects, I mean, we got stuff that makes some of the alien sci-fi stuff like, really, have you looked at dung beetles yet? And it's really kind of fun. So I think it's a hard time not being overly inspired by what's around us. It's just a fantastic planet we have.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, as you said, I did manage to get to New Zealand some years ago, and it's quite cool driving down the road and like pointing out the windshield. Well, that's Mount Doom over there. Yeah. That's so cool. So yeah, but obviously, as you can hear from my accent as well, I live in Denmark, so our landscape here is not that exciting. So there's not that much to look at. It's mostly like fields and flats. So that's it. But I think for me, I have like a notebook that is, well, it's probably filled with more ideas than I will ever get to write, I guess. I tend to pick it up from, it's more like scenes for me. So it could be that I watch a movie. It could be that I've read a book. It could just be some news from the real world that prompts some sort of idea in my head. And then I always write it down in my little notebook. But it often starts as just like small scenes like, well, this particular setting element would be cool. And then I might just have 2 lines about that. Or a character like this that got inspired for some movie I watched or something. That's really cool. I really like that. So I just have a few lines about that and so on. And then I have like 200 of those. And then when we need a new story, I can sort of go through them and see something. I mean, those 2 lines I can usually end up extrapolating into a full novel.
Yeah, but, I think... when I was in film before I decided to go. I'm a counselor now, and the biggest thing that stuck with me since then. My film teacher said, keep a small notebook with you. Like he was like, I'll buy one for you just to have on you at all times to write down ideas. And I think prospective authors, film people, D&D, world builders, whatever. I think it's because I get random ideas just from people I see walking by me or stuff. I'm like, oh, that's perfect, and write it down. So I think that will go a long way for people.
Yeah, I think to a large degree, it's more about, sometimes you have those people who say, well, I don't have any ideas. But I think it's more about being aware of the ideas because they occur all the time. And I personally believe that they occur everyone has them. But the problem is that you might not be aware that they occur.
Yeah, it could just be,
So you sort of need to train your mind a bit to latch on. Oh, that was an idea there. Yeah, and not just disregard it because, well, that was a stupid thought, but maybe it wasn't. Try to write it down and then leave it later on because maybe there's actually some meat on that bone.
Yeah, that's my issue. It's always, I'll remember it later. No, you won't.
No.
Oh, you won't.
It is gone faster than a dream when you wake up in the morning.
Definitely.
I mean, I guess that kind of answers something else I was curious about. But like, how do you, besides writing down passing thoughts and ideas, how do you go about keeping everything organized to keep from your beginning world building to your last world building of your story to keep everything internally consistent with each other? Because it can very easily you make something here that you forget about there, and then it contradicts itself.
Yeah. Well, that's of course a challenge, and usually I would say you need some sort of tool to do it. I'm trying to think of Obsidian Portal. Well, you guys, game player, you know all those portals there. Those are all good, and a lot of them has like free versions you can use. In our case, we still have it on our to-do list, but one of the things we're actually going to build our own, meaning that we're going to use the Storyworld's website to just function like Obsidian Portal, basically. Like, okay, so you can click around hyperlinking and digging and with pictures, and we're getting like customized artwork developed as well, and so on. So you can jump around and visit the different places, and then indeed, once you have a structure like that, then it also becomes much easier to just double check, what did I say about that section over there? And because I mean, originally the world building we did for the World of Elysium, which is the one we write in jointly, I think there's probably like 500 A4 pages or something like crazy like that, probably. But that sort of mingled in with the instructions as well. That became the course as well. So it's not only world building, but there's a lot, right? And scrolling through a Word document is like,
it's painful. You bookmark it and everything. But I'm the website builder, and we've talked about it. We want to make almost like our own encyclopedia that's hyperlinked, and there's some great plugins. You don't have to do it. There's other website themes that you can actually build right on your own website instead of using like World Anvil or Obsidian Portal, all those other ones. So there's a lot of options, but right now it's a Word document, or for me a Pages document, and it's a lot of hitting Apple F for search and find and going and double checking. But we'll get there. We're only on book 1. We'll be fine.
Apple F, Control F has been my best friend when running games or when needing to go to. It is a lifesaver. So I can't imagine what it was like when everything was pen and paper. Well, people probably more organized, or hopefully.
And pen and paper before Post-it notes, where you could at least flag the section.
Right.
I mean, something else that kind of makes me think of too. How do you go about giving all this information that you've now created and put a lot of work into? How do you give it out in small bursts, but also feel like you're not, if you want to have a twist or a turn, feel like you're not lying to the audience at the same time?
Oh, I lie to the reader all the time. Are you kidding? That's
Secret's
half
out.
the fun. Oh, they know. I do think character or reader misinformation, when you have a character that firmly believes something, it's so much fun. But again, you can't do it at malicious, purposefully and maliciously. You have to do it purposefully with the reveal and to have a plot to come from it. But you don't want to do that dreaded, like the info dump. It's so easy. But for me, I would say when you're writing, especially if you're just writing the first time and you're on the first draft, don't give a frig, just go ahead and write. But when you get back to editing, if you're really trying to plan this out, you have to take that apart and say, oh, well, you know what? There was a scene 2 chapters ago where I could drop in this hint. I love using senses. Everyone relies on visual, and then hearing second. What other thing can I talk about? The taste of it, the smell of it. Bring in those other things. One of my other big things is, don't just use the same word over and over again. If you see you're using dark or the same words to describe something, don't go pull out a thesaurus to find another word for dark, black, midnight. No, just talk about it, the texture of the bark of the trees. Talk about the mud. Talk about the different elements in the story. You always want to feed your reader a new piece of the whole picture, another brick, another pixel, however you want to put it. So every time you're slowly painting in a new part of the world. And that way, if you think I have 100,000 words, 120,000 words to share this world, not just this chapter, you'll do a much better job than not dumping everything on the reader at once.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of our previous podcast episodes. It's quite a while back, but we were talking about world building disease, basically, and info dumping in that episode. And I had queued up an audio clip, which is basically the intro clip for Lord of the Rings, the one where she talks about the 7 rings were forged and blah, 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 all that stuff, right? And just saying it now and also listening to it at the time, I get the goosebumps just from that. I love it. And I think that's part of the problem here, is that it is, for a lot of us who loves fantasy, it is those info dump things that actually draws us in. We like it too much, right? We love the entire setting that, well, this Dark Lord was there 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago or whatever. We love it. It brings us in, and it's all what we're fed up with in terms of, Tolkien and all that stuff. So, and then when we start telling our own stories, whether that being for role-playing or for writing, that's where we automatically go, right? We go, okay, so I need to start with this intro thing. So here is like 5 chapters about everything that happened 5,000 years ago, because that's probably good to know. Well, no, it's not. but I think that's, to a large extent, it's just a default go-to that we automatically start showing readers or role players that this is what happens. But it is really about always tying it back to the characters themselves and like what is important right now in this situation for this character. And then you intertwine the world building elements related to that situation and move on. And then the next situation comes maybe next chapter and you can add a bit more. So in the end, it will feel like the world was just fed to you in small little pieces, and you didn't even notice the small info dumps that were there because it just happened at part of the action and part of what the characters were doing. But that said, it's not easy, because I think you have to, at least for a lot of us, myself included, you have to unteach yourself the inclination to do those info dumps, because that's what we want to do, I think, a lot of us.
Yeah, it's one of those tropes that we enjoy. And especially, I mean, we've put so much work into this word. Like, I want to share this. I want to drop it out, and maybe it'll be important later. But like you said, you can very easily kind of weave it into the story and make it kind of come out and everything. Kind of like avoiding the stilted kind of like Maid and Butler dialogue of explaining stuff they already know, but it's explaining to the reader in a different format. But yeah, I like that. And Autumn, you're talking about the senses. I think that's something that is a problem for D&D people as well. They'll always just describe what you see. And it's kind of like this rule that I've kind of created to try to do, at least hit it when you're describing a scene, at least describe 3 or 4 senses. Give the players something to pull off of, get them into the characters a little better by grabbing, it smells this way or feels this way. It really changes how the scene progresses.
Absolutely.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, touch is one of my favorite, because I mean, it physically anchors you to the world. So many people ignore it, but when you start talking about the touch, the feel of the world, that is such a visual stimulation. That's the one that always gets me going. And I think it's one we often forget about, is just talking about the feel of bark, the feel of the horse, the warmth of another animal. And you're like, oh yeah, that. That is so neat. And it's so neglected.
Mm-hmm. So something for me is, whenever we've got this great flow, we're kind of in a state of extreme focus. World building can feel super easy and effortless, but there's also the times when your brain is empty and it's starting to feel like a chore. What do you do in those situations to either avoid or alleviate that?
Yeah, well, that can happen when writing. No, well, it can happen with writing too. That you sort of feel like I'm getting a bit stuck here. Well, I guess in our case, because with the writing, I'll get back to the world building element here in a second. But with the writing part, usually it doesn't happen with us because we have a detailed plot, so we know what's going to happen, so we don't get stuck. But in the plotting itself, you can get a bit stuck trying to figure out, how am I going to make it more interesting, or how I'm going to make it less obvious. And of course, the big no-no is to have the character make just the obvious stupid mistakes, because that makes it more interesting. Like your characters should be smart and they should know what they're doing. So it can be difficult. And the same thing in that sense also applies with the world building, where you just feel like, I feel like this is a bit, gray and boring, and how can I make it better? And I mean, I think everybody probably has a different solution for it. For me, it's often about stepping away from it. Going for a walk works wonders. Just getting out and just walk and get some fresh air in my face, that helps a lot. And usually it will come to me. And then sometimes it's like the next morning shower or something, then all of a sudden, whoa, now I got it. So usually it's like when you try to not think about it too hard and you do something else instead and walk away from it, then in the back of your mind is actually working on it, and it will come up with a solution. You just have to try to not force it.
I think what if questions work so well here too. I often come up with, like, I try to have a set writing time, and if I'm like 5 minutes into it, 10 minutes into it, and it's not flowing, whether I'm world building or whatever, I don't want to walk away. I make myself sit there for at least half an hour and give it a try. And so coming up with, I often just, start a different document or go to the bottom of the page and just delete it later. Do what if questions. What if this is happening? What if, try to get into the character's mind. The character is doing this. Why? What does she see? What is she smelling? Just start developing something else and try to get into the character's perspective. Because I think by bringing it to life, when you have this overarching, like, step back, I am God view and I am building things, it can be a little boring, but when you start thinking of it in terms of your story and what is the character experiencing and why are they there and what are they going to see? And if you have a map, pull that out and say, oh, well, look, they're in the middle of a swamp. What is that going to be like? Why do they have to go this way versus that way? What kind of creatures live there? Are they going to be attacked? And again, you just start brainstorming for like 5-10 minutes. And the next thing you know, you're like, oh yeah, this is great. So even if you go back and write it later, and I think that's important with the role-playing games, maybe you're trying not to go back too often to fix things up. But to me, writing, I think authors have to realize that first draft is just not that big of a deal. It's huge to get it done, but you're going to go back and you're going to fix it. It's like a Rubik's Cube that is totally out of, all the color sequences are totally wrong. You're going to go put it back in order. So go ahead and just write it down, get it going, and yeah, you're probably going to come back and fix it up and change it up a little bit and make it even better. But you can't do that until you actually have something written.
Yeah, it's easy
a
to
swamp
be
dragon.
It's easy to be like intimidated too, like looking at this big map, like, oh my goodness, but I think looking at it from that perspective of like the players are starting here, my story is starting here. What does that feel like? How does that, and you can slowly like kind of expand from there. That's why I told Braxton when he was starting at his first world, like, start where we're starting and expand from there, because the stuff way over World Builder sees stuff way over there is not gonna matter for years until we get there. So just start small.
It's very true. Something I learned in acting, though, is a lot of information influences everything you do, as Jesper and Autumn have mentioned already. So sometimes it's okay to add other stuff, but you got to be productive, and you've got to get that I guess the car on the road, the train on the track, and get it going so they can see everything. And for me, something I really tend to struggle with, just because of everything that's going on around this topic, and especially within the tabletop RPG scope. D&D has been reformatting, reworking a lot of their content, particularly around characters or races, to be a bit more politically correct. How do you tend to develop the cultures of your world without making them into stereotypes?
Oh, that's a good one. I think the biggest thing is that they should be developed. If you're not set in this planet, especially if you're creating your own world, the races, everything that should be developed out of that should be because of that world. So if you have a race of creatures that are growing up on an archipelago, they're going to, what are they going to eat? How are they going to evolve to have lived and created a culture in that place? And by doing that, it makes it more authentic. Like I said, I like the history and the ecology. You want to make it so that, as Jesper had said earlier, that if you drop them into another world, it's not going to work because they didn't grow up and develop and evolve in that world and have those impacts from the weather, the climate, the history, how they marry, how they say hello. All those things should be very particular to that place and who they are as a society.
Yeah, and we had quite an interesting debate going on over the last week or so in some author communities about exactly this point about there was a lot of racism discussions as well about I don't know, maybe it's because I live in a different part of the world, but I don't quite get the conversation, meaning that in a fantasy world, it's fantasy creatures and races and people, and it's all made up. So how can you be racist about? I don't quite get it, because I mean, yes, maybe in our view these people are racist, but in their world it's different rules than it is in our world. But of course, again, maybe the difference between role-playing and commercial fiction, obviously you need to be a bit aware of it if you're writing to sell novels, because if you're like sort of pissing off, sorry for the language, but if you're pissing off half of your readers because they feel like you are being something I don't want to say here, then yeah, that's probably not a good idea, right? But I think it's more important to just be mindful about it. If you're really concerned, you can of course check with some other people to see if is this too much. So be mindful about it, but I would say don't get dictated by it. I mean, if it makes sense that this is how this culture works, then that's how the culture works.
Yeah, and even, well, I was just gonna say really quick, it's even like, I mean, sci-fi and fantasy has been used as like almost like not really a parallel, but way for us to see, world problems in different lights. It can be a good way to explore these things too, without,
Yeah.
There's absolutely a duality to it. I mean, on one end, and this is a conversation for another day, there's censorship and artistic integrity, and then there's mindfulness. And I think both sides have great points, but ultimately there's no way to make a choice other than just either protect your viewers or, go with your artistic integrity. And it just kind of depends on where you lie there. But for me, that's kind of everything that I wanted to initially ask you guys about. Ryan, was there something else that came to your minds that you wanted to jump to?
No, I mean, I feel like there's only so much you can talk about,
right.
in a short time span of world. When you're creating a world, this is a lot of moving parts. But I mean, I feel like your guys' course that you guys are working, the 12 modules, I believe is what it is, will probably kind of hit everything else in between. So if you guys want to talk about that for a little bit before we end?
Yeah.
Sure. Go ahead.
I'll let you do that, Autumn.
Oh, you would. So we were like playing straws. But so it's called Crafting Incredible Fantasy Worlds. And yes, it is 12 modules, but there's a lot into it. I remember building it, and I think it has 100 videos. I think I kind of counted. So it's a big course, but you don't have to do all of them. That's the good news. And it's self-paced. And yes, it starts with the idea of developing a story that goes with your world, or I should say a world that goes with a story. So you're developing both at the same time. And when you're done, you'll have a map and you'll have an idea of how to write. So the first 6 are really, actually I'd say it's 7, because module 7 is creating the rules for the magic. And after you finish those first 7, you pretty much have everything in place to start writing. And so after that, it talks a little bit more about world building disease, how to weave in all those details without like just going on top of your reader, and all of the fun stuff like that. So it's a really cool, I'm impressed that we put it together. It took us 2 years.
2.5, I think.
I think, yeah.
Wow.
It was a lot of work to put together, but the end result is pretty spectacular.
Yeah, it shows in you guys' passion for it. I'm definitely interested.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we'll have mentioned it in the beginning as well in our own kind of pre-recorded intro, telling about the dates and everything to expect. But if you guys would like to drop those as well, that'd be perfect.
Sure. It is, so this is only the second time it's going to be open, and the first time open to the general public. The first time we just opened it up to our own internal list. So this is the big launch. Yay!
Big drop.
It's going to be from May 3rd to May 8th. And so we just have a little bit limited time because it is big, and part of what it comes with is a monthly question and answer session that's live, just like the Zoom call. So we don't want to let in 10,000 people and have it all spaced out and not know where anyone is. So it's kind of a limited time, and it's a first big launch.
Yeah. And we usually open 2 times a year. So if somebody misses it, they will, you can use the same link and everything, and then it'll go and ask you if you want to be added to a wait list, and you can just put in your name there, and then we'll let you know when it opens again if you miss it. Or maybe if you feel like, I don't quite have the money for it right now, but I would like to get back to it, and you can just add your list to the wait list or your name to the wait list, and there's no obligation of doing so. So you can just remove yourself again later on if you want. but we thought it was very interesting to talk to you guys as well, because obviously initially this course was built for with fiction writing in mind, but I personally think, also coming from sort of this gaming background like you guys, I think probably 80% of the course is something you can plug directly into your game master pot of tools and work off. And then there might be a few modules or bit in the beginning and a bit in the end where you can ignore a bit of it. If you're not into writing novels, then you can just sort of skip some of that. But the meat of it, 80% in the middle, all the development stuff and the creators lab, like I mentioned earlier on, that's something you can use straight up in game mastering. So that was why I thought it would be really interesting to talk to you guys and mention it here, because just maybe some of your listeners would be interested.
I'm
Yeah.
interested.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some really good fantasy series, not even trilogies, but like long-term series that have come out of people's like D&D tabletop games. So if anyone's listening, if anyone's listening to this and be like, hey, my story is awesome, my world's awesome, then get into it with this and then go listen to their podcast and writing fantasy and get even more in depth on writing a story and stuff. Because I mean, there's some cool stories that can be told through D&D and then can even be told much better in book format.
And we'll have all the important links in the description as well. But where can people find you guys?
Well, I guess the easiest thing is to, if you want to learn more about sort of the story creation and all fantasy world building and so on, then amwritingfantasy.com is the best place to go. We even actually, once you arrive on that page, we have a totally free course as well that you can get access to, which is, it's focused on how to publish novels and so on, and all the marketing and cover designs and everything you need to know about that. So if anybody's interested, there is a free course you can get straight onto there. But if you're more interested in what we're writing, like the fiction, the stories and stuff like that, then you should probably just go to amreadingfantasy.com. You see how that works?
Clever, weren't we?
It is.
Yeah, but I would say, especially what you said, if you look at this course, 80% of it will apply if you're doing gaming. That's only 20% you need to learn to write a book. So this might be a good way to kind of get your feet wet.
Honestly, I would even argue that even if the writing portion of the course is incredibly technical about spacing or just formatting, I would still argue that during that writing portion, it can still teach you ways to structure how you're speaking, the way you present things. So I'd still say 100% of it would be useful for anybody that's looking to run D&D.
There's some D&D modules that are not written very well, and they're tough to
word.
read, or the inscriptions are just non-existent. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, we looked around quite a lot in the beginning when we created this course, because I was actually trying to figure out, does anything like this exist? And I mean, maybe it does. Maybe it was just my million hours of Google searching that didn't find it. But I just could not find anywhere where I could find like a single one place where I can get the end-to-end world building information. Exactly what do I need to do in one place? I could not find, like Ryan said earlier, I could also find 500 different web pages with 100 questions each, and it's just like one big mess. So the world building course in itself, it's not like we're going to bring something to you that you have never, ever heard about before. You'll probably recognize quite a lot of it, but the difference is that it's now structured, it is streamlined, and it's packaged together. So you can follow it from start to finish, and you have what you need. That's really I would say the main benefit of it. It's not because we have like revolutionized world building and have something you've never heard about before.
That's a big selling point, though. It's so hard to figure out where to start, how to move through it. You can look up stuff, and everyone's got a different YouTube. Everyone's got a different way to go about it, and it can get overwhelming.
Right. And as usual, speaking of YouTubes and links and whatnot, you can always reach out to the Dungeon Crawl over here at Dungeon Crawl Pod, or the Dungeon Crawl Pod on Twitter and Instagram, or if you're looking for like long form communication, like how Jesper found us, the Dungeon Crawl Pod at gmail.com. As always, he's been Ryan. Directions.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
this way.
He's
Cool.
been Braxton.
And they've been Birt and Jesper Schmidt of Writing Fantasy. Thank you, everybody, for crawling with us. We'll see you guys next time.
Take care.